And welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast, YouTube channel, various things where myself, Glenn Ford, and this guy, Mike Hutchinson, talk about how to design better miniatures games, or at least how to design miniatures games, and hopefully there's a bit of betterment going on. So we're going to have a chat today in relation to a subject that's brought up as a question in the comments below one of the other videos, and it's a question in relation to why to use measuring sticks or measuring tapes versus templates for movement in your minis game. Now, obviously, Gaslands uses templates, whilst Billion Suns uses measuring sticks. So presumably we've got opinions on why you would choose one over the other and why you then go back again to the other one.
We better. Let's hope.
Well, let's hope so. So I'm going to crack in with saying the obvious question, I guess, a few people would ask at this point is, Mike, why did you use templates in Gaslands as opposed to tape measures? I've got some opinions as to why you did, but I'd like to hear your first thought about what motivated you to make that design choice.
So the silly answer is because of the way that skid marks work with tires, but the real answer is, I guess, momentum and not having full freedom of movement. So I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of momentum in movement systems, and depending on how you write them, like either a measured a measuring stick or a tape measure or a template can be like you have to move all the way to the end, or you have to use all your movement, or it can be you can just use a partial movement. And so the movements templates in Gaslands were about describing like a finite set of spaces that you could end up in, and meaning that if you were about to crash into something, you couldn't just get away with saying, oh, well, I'm only going to move a teeny bit, even though I've got a movement of 6 inches, I'm going to move like a quarter of an inch, because it doesn't represent the momentum, the speed of the vehicles, and doesn't force those funny moments where things can't get out of the way of each other fast enough.
Yeah, and I think sort of we'll probably sort of talk about the pros and cons in this conversation, but I think in relation to that, one of the huge pros of the templates in Gaslands is that it immediately creates this visual spatial reasoning puzzle, and it's one of the most satisfying I find whenever I go back to play it again now or play at a convention. One of the most satisfying things in Gaslands is when you slot the right template into exactly the right space, and it just like a little jigsaw puzzle piece, and you cannot get that with a tape measure, and it's so nice when it happens.
An aura heavy miniature game with tape measures where the position of your miniature really matters, and particularly in skirmish games where you have very, very fluid movement. And to be honest with you, this happens in A Billion Suns as well. Like the exact place that you pop that model is itself a spatial puzzle, but I think it's much more irritating and less satisfying than the placement of a template. Like trigonometry, finding out where's the exact space where you can't charge me, but I can whip you with my sword, and blah 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 blah.
I think it's much rarer that you get the payout of getting it right, is what I would say about that version of the puzzle. The sort of thing you get in something like Malifaux, it's relatively rare that you, even when you put them all in exactly the right space and it covers exactly the right things with its auras, and it can be charged, it can't be charged, and everything's perfect, you don't get that same sensation as when you a template into the shape and it fits exactly between two other things and it pops you out in exactly the right way. There's just something tactile about being able to slot the template down and see that it physically fits. You can't really do that with a tape measure, and you can't when you place them all down and it's got like 3 auras affecting 4 other things in 3 different ways. You have to sort of check each of them with the tape measure, and then you get to sort of stroke your chin and go, yes, that was the correct decision that I made. Whereas when you drop that template down, it's just like there.
Yeah, and interestingly, for this discussion, in Blaster Volume 2, I wrote Mystic Skies, and Mystic Skies uses Gasland's movement templates, and it has two classes of miniature. It has foot grunts and monsters and people with legs, and then it has wizards on magic carpets or flying mounted beasts or whatever. And what I ended up doing in the design of that was using all of the full range of movement templates for the flying wizard, because it felt right that the flying wizard had that sort of momentum and couldn't turn on a dime. And if it was tearing across the battlefield, because in Mystic Skies, the wizards get 4, 5, 6 activations for every one activation of a foot slogging monster or minion. And so it felt right that because they're getting all those extra activations, they're tearing across the thing and they can't just inch forward for their 5th activation. That doesn't make any sense. But I ended up using the movement templates just as movement sticks. So foot slogs get like, they can move in any direction. You can pivot them before they move to any direction. And then you simply place the movement values like short, medium, or long. So you just place the matching straight template, and then they can travel as far down that template as they like, placing in the sort of final position spot on the template if they want to go that far. And so, although I use templates for the foot sloggers in Mystic Skies, there's no difference. Like that could just be a 12 centimeter measurement of like, I get my tape measure out. So I think it's absolutely about, I find movement templates interesting when I am restricting the choice, or rather I'm forcing you to make a minimum movement. And maybe this is sort of, I mean, it's a very vehicles type thing, but I think it comes from naval games, like, you know, my playing of Man of War as a kid, like, or my playing of spaceship games as a kid. Like, there's a very common trope of you have to move a minimum number of inches before you're allowed to make a 45-degree turn. And in many regards, like, Gaslands is simply just a more user-friendly version of you have to move forward 2 inches before you can do a 45-degree turn.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the user friendliness of that system is, to my mind, a huge part of the pro of using templates, and particularly the pro of using templates in Gaslands. Because I remember we were sort of having conversations about it very, very early on, and again, obviously looking at the movement system in X-Wing and just going, there's no way you could write this movement system in as few pages as they use in X-Wing if they didn't use templates. You know, and looking at the movement section in something like Warhammer or you know, even relatively sort of short form skirmish games with very simple point-to-point movement, but once there's terrain and then there's line of sight and all these bits and pieces, it's certainly when you're moving anything that wheels or has to move like a unit, it's just so much easier writing the rules for templates than it is for tape measures. It's less difficult when it is a single model or a sort of a squad. But once you've got a ranked up unit, you've got to write how wheels work and closing the door when you charge somebody. It is a hell of a thing to have to write those rules.
Interestingly, I've not played it, but I looked at it with interest and read the rule book. I forget the name of it now, but the Fantasy Flight Units game.
I want to say, yeah, I was thinking of this as we were talking, and I want to say RuneQuest, and I'm
it's not
sure.
It's not RuneQuest. But
no,
it's something. Yeah, something like
it's
that.
not many miles from that. Yeah, no, because I remember it coming out, and I remember it sort of being, oh, you know, this is off the back of X-Wing. They're using some of the same systems as X-Wing, and I don't know. I don't think it did fantastically well. And
no, but I don't know if that was the rule set or the background. But like, imagining like there's an attraction in the connection there, because like, in my mind at least, what taking a block of infantry and using an X-Wing movement templates is saying is, it's tricky for a unit of infantrymen to like wheel round, and once they start moving, it's also quite difficult for them to stop, because the guy at the front is going to stop and then he's going to bump into him, and the guy 6 ranks back has got to notice in time. So like, shuffling forward like 2 degrees as a unit, that feels like, on the one hand, it feels like a realistic fudging of the rules, where it's like, well, as our friend Rufus often says, like, what, my guy can't turn his head more than 90 degrees, what is this?
Yeah.
So like being allowed to wheel to degrees sort of accounts for some of that like rigid arm He-Man stuff that's going on. But at the same time, like, probably if a unit is moving, it should probably have a momentum that, like, well, it's really difficult for them to move more than that. But at the same time, as I imagined playing that on the table, possibly because I was conditioned to it, but like it just felt like that was almost too large an object to follow these templates. Like in X-Wing, I don't know if you feel the same, but like those big base ships, like the Millennium Falcon and stuff, they just always feel a bit clunky. Like the first base size, the normal X-Wing and TIE Fighter base size feels very elegant and swish, and those ones just feel a bit like this is a bit naff.
No, I know what you mean. There is something satisfying about sliding an actual X-Wing or TIE Fighter down those templates and making the little noises. I think these are not non-concerns. They sound like silly things, but I think these are not a nothing concern. Whereas when you're moving the bigger ships down there, you don't have that kind of satisfaction. I think it possibly...
Well, and also the template doesn't describe the path of the object. That's one of the things I think that's satisfying in Gaslands, as with the starter box of X-Wing, is that these little toy cars, very deliberately are the same width as the template, and so you can make a sort of somewhat childish sort of. That's why I was talking at the beginning about how they're the sort of skid marks from the tires, because that's broadly, like, in my mind, that's what they are.
Yeah, I think possibly that it depends on if you're doing it for units. It possibly depends on whether you're trying to create the idea that units are trained to perform certain maneuvers, and they've been trained to do this maneuver and that maneuver, and if you want them to stop partway through, there's a certain
they don't have the drum beat for that. They don't know how to do it.
Versus, I always feel like the thing with like something like Warhammer, that is more trying to recreate the fact that units are constantly shuffling ever so slightly. There's a little bit shuffling here and a little bit shuffling there and a little bit shuffling there. Like relatively famously, Spartan units, your shield protects the guy to the side of you, and because of that, when they charged, the units drifted because everyone's trying to get under the shield of the guy next to them. So they would always go off. They wouldn't charge in a straight line because they'd always go slightly diagonal.
That's a sweet fact. Love it.
And I think a certain amount of that sort of measuring tape movement, partly it's this ideal of a unit will do a little shuffle and a little shuffle and a little shuffle as people's feet are sort of shuffling backwards and forwards until the moment to do a charge, and then you charge pretty much in a straight line. And wheeling is actually quite rare and something generally to be avoided. And so sort of there is, I think, an implication sometimes in the X-Wing templates that you're obviously going to do these dogfightery maneuvers, and possibly the tape measure has less of an implication of that. So I think a lot of it, I think it's so often in these subjects we come up with a lot of it, I think, is about the feel that you're trying to suggest. Whether it's, I think that a movement template for a skirmishing, again with single models or squads, would be a bit crazy. I don't know. I can't imagine. I can't imagine a game like Malifaux using those templates.
Right, but for me, the templates are very much about momentum. So if I was writing a game which only featured Space Marines with ice skates on a frozen death world, then I'd probably use templates and it would probably feel right.
I mean, I would genuinely...
I mean, a less silly example would be like, I keep almost writing a sort of jetpack 0G thing. And that, like, the two-dimensional version of that is basically the Gaslands with like jetpack dudes, and you're like, well, they can't stop because once you do a little squirt of gas, like woof, they're off. And
yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's at all insane to do like a roller derby, skirmish game where a sort of speedball version of Blood Bowl or something where everyone's on roller skates while they're playing it.
I mean, one of the interesting things is if you actually get your old copy of Man of War out, you find that there's this funny turning template doodad. And in many respects, it is just a movement template. It's a sort of movement key, a bit like in Car Wars. But like you line it up and you push it along, and then you sort of turn it round so it fits on the other thing. So it's quite a user-friendly piece of equipment that's trying to make a slightly fiddly, particularly the measuring of 45 degrees, slightly more comfortable. But baked into that system is two things. One is I don't have to turn all of the 45 degrees. I can make a partial pivot. And the other is that once I've made that first 2 inches to allow me to make the pivot, I then don't have to follow on with the full 2 inches, which I always found like, slightly odd, because, you're in a situation where you've got like, a whole bunch of sails and stuff. And I know you can let them out and things like that to go slower, but it also feels like a place where, making a sailboat suddenly go faster or suddenly go slower isn't really a thing. Like, they take quite a long time to change their velocity. And so I think I guess what I'm saying is I feel like Man of War has got a hybrid system that's neither tape measures nor templates. It basically is a measuring system with tape measures in its description of the rules, but the fact that it provides that turning key, I think, pushes it over into like, well, actually my 7-year-old younger brother can like understand how to move these ships quite easily, because you've given him a thing that's really kind of easy to use. And so I think that there's not enough thought given in tabletop games, because they're so DIY, because they're so like, the expectation is it's so like, scrap it together from whatever you've got lying around the house. I think even in an ethos around a really DIY ethos, I think you can provide better user experiences, more easily accessible player ding dongs, whether that's the right kind of unit card, whether that's the right kind of summary table, or whether it's the bits and bobs that you use to measure shooting or movement. I think those are really important considerations of like, even if you've got a skirmish game with really flexible 360-degree movement, like, is there a thing that I could do in my game which just makes it so much easier to do, figuring out whether I'm in cover or whether I can snipe, or doing like, you can imagine a sort of cover hugging shooter thing where every model gets a sort of barrel roll move, and maybe you have a little template to explain like where their barrel roll into cover hugging mechanic is. Like, I just think there's a lot that you can do with little ding dongs like that, and I think that's the templates in Gaslands are very much trying to make it more accessible, just more friendly to approach.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the major pros, and potentially one of the possible cons, but certainly I think one of the major pros of a template is you can write stuff on the template when you're making it. Obviously Gaslands has the gears marked on it. It has the exits, the slide exit arrow. You can write pertinent information onto the template. You can contain rules in it. The fact that in order to know which template is available in which gear in Gaslands, you just need to look at it. Is a huge help at the tabletop. Certainly whenever I run it at a convention, the fact that I can just go, well, just look at it, has it got the gear written on it and it's available, is a huge benefit, I think, to using the game. If there is a potential with that, is that of course you are to then some degree locked into what is written on those templates. I mean, I think it's interesting with X-Wing, like halfway through the first sort of season of X-Wing, they started adding in the ability for certain ships to turn on maneuvers that didn't have it marked on the template that you could turn on that maneuver. So that they always had it moved on that you could do the 180.
The 180-degree move.
Well, you always had marked on the original templates you could do the 180, like with the TIE fighter or whatever, on a straight, and then they added in the fact that the new X-Wing could do a 90-degree turn off of a curve, and that wasn't marked on the original templates. And then the second edition starter set had it marked on those templates, and it was a bit like, yeah, we ran out of things we could do with these templates, so now we have to we can't make more templates that would actually force the people who bought the original ones to buy the new templates, but we're going to say that the things written on them are just notations, they're not a necessity. So yeah, being sort of tied to the templates is potentially, if you intend to put out more things and expansions for the game, possibly a con. But I think the fact that you can write things on templates is a huge benefit. I mean, like I say, with Gaslands, if you imagine trying to explain doing a swerve and then having a slide out of the swerve in the way that Gaslands does it, with just words and measuring tapes. I don't think you could even do it, let alone that it would be very, very hard. I think it would be genuinely sort of impossible to actually achieve the way that you'd have to sort of describe that. And I think also bits like the way that the skid dice work with Gaslands, where it's like, okay, because there is a sort of a finite movement here, there is then ways you can come out of this finite movement. The restriction of choices allows you to play those choices a bit more. Whereas if you had a non-restricted movement, like in Warhammer, you couldn't then make someone roll dice to go, okay, partway through your movement, which you haven't decided how far it is, you then have to move in this direction a little bit. It's a bit like, well, I haven't decided how far my movement is, so that's not really going to work. So yeah, I think it's a bit about what you're trying to describe about the game, what you're trying to achieve with it. I think that obviously templates.
I mean, the other problem with the templates is, there is an assumption, I think, perfectly reasonable assumption, that wargamers own tape measures, whereas for Gaslands, I basically invited people to print something out and stick it on cereal box, which I also feel is pretty acceptable given the fact that people have the time and energy to make cardboard gas stations and post-apocalyptic terrain. But I did get the occasional comment of like, well, I don't have access to a printer, like what am I supposed to do? And that's why I set up the Friends of Gasland scheme to help kind of populate the world with laser cut templates. But I think that's the other key downside, is like, now your game has components, and depending on your distribution method, that could be a bit of a barrier to like actually getting the game set up. But I think that assuming tape measures seems perfectly rational, there's something that just doesn't quite sit right in my mouth about assuming tape measures. Like there's something about that feels like it just restricts the audience a little bit, and if you just didn't do that, maybe more board game people would get into miniatures games. But it's not a strong sense I have. It just feels like it's just one sort of quite old school piece of equipment.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think you've hit on something there. I think that it's not weird to assume that people own a tape measure. I think that plenty of non-gamers own tape measure. I think most households probably have one. It's not unusual.
It's in the toolkit for when you fix the kitchen shelf.
But there is something. I mean, it's way back when we sort of started this channel. We were like, maybe we should call it miniatures and measures. There's something inherent to a sort of form of tabletop gaming, which involves getting out a tape measure and measuring things, that I think turns off a certain sort of a certain potential audience member.
Well, I think this is an erroneous comparison, but I think potentially there's like a relationship between a sort of idea of ground scale and maps and like accuracy of conversion of measurements, where it's like, well, this naval vessel has got a 80-pound gun and it shoots this far, and therefore if you divide that by 7 and times it by 12, you get to an accurate scaled replication of that, and that's going to be 72 inches or 78 inches, and I can measure that with my tape measure. And I think that's all not very gamey and doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're playing a cartoony superhero game. That's all like a little bit looking at ordnance survey maps for perhaps most people's idea of fun.
No, absolutely. And I think that there are some very, very old school games that literally just say, okay, this is the ground scale of this game. I assume you'll now go and look up the battleship in question and figure out how far it can move. I shan't tell you.
Exactly. I have an old, in fact, I'll grab it from the shelf here. I have a game entitled Microfleet World War II, which has a lot of little templates for ships. Doesn't have movement templates, but this game lists movement values in real world distances and speeds. So it just says like, this one travels 20 knots, and you have to you just it tells you what the ground scale is, or no, it doesn't, because it depends what scale of ship you're playing. So if you know it's 20 knots, then of course you know what that is. Gentlemen will measure that out.
And I think there's something about tape measures that harkens back to that word. And I think it's very interesting where sometimes you get like GW boxed sets where they put in measuring sticks that don't look like tape measures and don't even
those are back. Ash Barker was getting very enthusiastic about the whippy sticks, as he calls them, because we all got them in our Necromunda box sets, but they've just put them in their newest thing. So back.
And I think quite often they've put out box sets that specifically don't have inches on the measuring stick, that just have like movement distances, and every now and again they try and move away from the fact that they're 4 inches or 10 inches.
They're boxed games, like the ones with Space Marines shooting at Gene Stealers or whatever, like the sort of Space Hulky type things, but they're a little bit more skirmish game. Yeah, they have these sort of I think the most recent Blood Bowl might have the same. They have a sort of Perspex floppy ruler, which has, numbers up it, but it won't tell you what they are because it doesn't want to. It wants to make it really gamey and nothing to do with scale, which I think is to be considered.
Yeah, and I think that's something else to consider is the audience, the effect that getting a tape measure out and saying, it's 6 inches for some reason will make some people twitch when they hear that.
Also that British wargaming and American wargaming, but British wargaming particularly is still done in Imperial.
Yeah, I was reading a French rule set the other day, and they referred to everything in centimeters, and for some reason it felt completely alien. I use centimeters and millimeters in almost every part of my life apart from wargaming, right? And yet reading centimeters in a set of wargames rules was just like, this is what do you mean the table?
But then again, you measure things in miles per hour and miles from your house. So when dealing with ordnance survey maps, we deal in imperial measurements.
We're in a weird place, but looking at a rule set that said that the table was 60 centimeters across really made me go, "What? No, you mean 2 feet? It's 2 feet across. You French lunatic." So I think so. Yeah, a lot of it is about the feel of the game, the audience you're looking for, how restricted, how complicated, whether you want to put things onto the template, whether you want to go a bit more old school and sort of say, okay, you have freedom of movement, here's a tape measure, you can move up to X many centimeters, redefine yourself as you go. Yeah, I think that's a solid enough explanation of some of the pros and cons of these two movement systems. And on that note,
is a whole other movement system we've missed off?
I mean, none immediately occur, but there's Disc Wars.
Oh yeah, there's Disc Wars.
There's always Disc Wars.
Yeah, we don't talk enough about Disc Wars on this channel.
I don't think you can talk enough about Disc Wars. That might be a rule for life. Other than like gridded systems, it's funny. I see.
Yeah, we don't talk a lot about gridded systems. I think we've had a conversation off air about the non-discrete versus the discrete movement systems. And I suppose this channel tends to naturally. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, I've had conversations with people who have sort of said, okay, I've converted Warhammer 40k into a fully gridded system. It works exactly the same. You just have a gridded layout, and I don't have to use a tape measure, and it cuts down on arguments and it seemed. And I've had a conversation with somebody who says it seems that the only reason that Warhammer players or whatever are obsessed with tape measures is that they just love arguments. They just enjoy having pointless fights over things. You get so little out of the tape measure versus a grid, and with a grid no one ever argues. You can't argue if it's on a grid. It's just, well, it takes many spaces away. And I've fought the corner of tape measures, but quite often I've sort of thought, yeah, we are just sort of an ornery bunch sometimes.
If you just want pure gameplay, I think there is a real argument for the crispness of discrete grid-based movement. It can be big hexes that fit like 5 dudes in. It can be a full, inch square Dungeons and Dragons map. But for me, because of the gaming upbringing I've had, like the ability to sort of move non-discretely, move discretely to exactly where I want and climb up this piece of wreckage and go over here. Like that's sort of hardwired into my conception. But of course, in some regards, all of that is nonsense, because wouldn't it just be more interesting that, like, as long as the piece of scenery is inside this hex, then I can put them wherever they look cool and don't fall off terrain, and we know what they are and they all get cover or something. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's two arguments, in my opinion, against the grid system or a hex system. One is, like I said, I don't think a game like Malifaux would work with a grid or hex system. I think that when you get really into the nuts and bolts of a complicated Malifaux game, the relationships become too non-discrete and complex. And the probably the single biggest reason is the barrier to entry that is having a 4 foot by 6 foot gridded layout. I mean, certainly as a youth, I used to play on bare tabletops, and the idea that you can't play this kind of game on a bare tabletop, I wouldn't say offends me, but it irritates me, the idea that somebody has to have, printed out something, something that covers 3, 4, or 6 by 4 feet.
I mean, I spent a lot of my youth playing Silent Death and BattleTech, and so like I had a fair amount of experience with playing with those things. But the problem I had was, or what I liked, was the fact that I could put a green flock table out and it could be anything that my imagination conjured up. But in these other situations, I had a pre-printed illustrated map. I mean, okay, it's a space map in the case of Silent Death, but it just looked more like a board game to me. It just wasn't that same like train set sort of, it just separates it from the model making aspect for me. Like, instead of it being a diorama of all this stuff going on, it's very gamic. It's very obviously and demonstrating its gameness. But yeah, it's interesting. Like I mean, that's why that every time I think this game would be better with hexes or grids, I just reject it because it's like, well, I'm just introducing a ridiculous barrier to entry, and this game will be much less successful if I write it for this stupid additional requirement for setup, and no one's going to like it and everyone's going to be irritated, and so I'm just not going to do it. And it's silly because like there's a huge market of BattleTech maps. Like Aeronauticus Imperialis has these wonderful full color hex maps. Like, there's plenty of ways, Deep Cut Studios will print literally any of their gorgeous maps with a hex grid or a square grid of any size that you want. Like, it's completely feasible.
Yep.
But I do think that's the major thing for me. I actually disagree with you on the granularity point. I think if Malifaux had like inch squares and you could only be in one of those inch squares and your auras were like 1, 2, 3 things around, like it might not be exactly the same, but I think it would be a damn sight easier to play.
I mean, possibly, quite how circles work on sort of gridded systems and going diagonally with line of sight can be tricky. But anyway, this was a conversation about measuring sticks versus templates. If there's to be a conversation about grid systems for these sorts of games, then I'm sure people will pop up in the comments and let us know that they want to hear it. If you do want to hear such a conversation, please pop up in the comments.
We've got anything else to say about it? We've definitely got more to say about it.
We always have more to say about everything. It's one of
proper penny in the slot talk.
It's one of our more endearing qualities. For now, I think we'll sign off on this edition of Rule of Carnage. Thank you for watching to this point, if you still are. If you are, please like and subscribe. If you sat through this, I assume you enjoyed some part of it. Do you want to hear more opinions about movement systems? Do you want to hear about grid movement systems? Do you want to hear about anything? This was from a comment that was left in another video. If you want to hear about something, put a comment in a video. I will read it and we will eventually talk about it. Look us up on social media, but for now I think it's going to be thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.